Hello, and welcome to the webinar, How to Leverage Innovation Clusters, Turning Ideas into Impact. My name is Anthony Schiavo. I'm a Senior Director and Principal Analyst here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating and presenting during today's webinar. Joining me for this discussion is my colleague, Chris Robinson, Senior Director here at Lux. Throughout this webinar, you can type any questions you have into the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is still strong. So with that, let's jump into the presentation. So today we're going to be talking about innovation clusters. And first, we want to set up a little bit the pressures that innovators are feeling and why innovation clusters are going to be even more important than ever before. Then we'll get into innovation clusters themselves, what they are, how we define them, and how you can build them into a balanced innovation strategy. And then we'll touch a little bit on the case for long-term innovation. So Chris, tell me about these innovators under pressure.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. And thank you to everyone joining today. And I think it's no secret that it's harder to innovate within a company today than it would have been even say just 2 or 3 years ago. In our roles, a lot of what we do at Lux is actually talk to some of our clients and prospective clients, understanding what are kind of the drivers and goals of innovation teams, but also what are some of the pressures that many companies face. And we hear some common themes when we talk to companies today, which is innovation teams are facing reduced budgets. They're seeing headcount reduced, or they're seeing their goals shifted from longer term to more near term core focused operations. But it's not just looking at corporate innovation. Looking at the other side of the coin for entrepreneurs, it's become more difficult. For a lot of the clients we work with across chemicals, industrial sectors, the energy sector, and CPG companies, many have cared about decarbonization or the circular economy that all fall kind of under this theme of clean tech. And it's very clear to say right now, we're really through this kind of bubble in funding that we saw within clean tech over the last few years that really arose from a combination of low interest rates, very favorable policy supporting decarbonization, and crucially exit opportunities like the SPAC boom that created an opportunity for many startups to exit and for a lot of venture capital folks to make returns on some of their early stage investments. And so it has become more difficult as an entrepreneur with less enthusiasm to invest in some of these technologies. But something that's made it, I would say, even more challenging is really how the political landscape has changed around funding. And this is especially true in the United States, where some of the institutions and funding opportunities that really made the United States a hub for startup formation within clean tech and other areas like biotech, digital technologies like AI as well, has been cuts to some of the early scientific research that's done within national labs or other federal institutes, or some of the grant funding available to small businesses, or even some of the later stage funding like the Loan Programs Office that helps fund later stage project development for some of these emerging technologies. And it isn't just necessarily restricted to the United States. Obviously, things like the tariff policy and things like H-1Bs have in fact impacted the ability for small companies to continue innovating, and it's had more of an international effect as well. And unsurprisingly, as a result of all this, when we put out our innovation survey to different innovation executives, we saw a really clear theme, which was the category of things that fall under the umbrella of doing new things, like transforming the business, adopting new technologies, or finding opportunities in climate sustainability related initiatives. All of those saw a decreased prioritization in favor of really focusing on the core and driving business growth within the core, which is unsurprising given the amount of uncertainty we see in the future. And ultimately, this is kind of reflected in something we've heard from multiple startups. When we were down in New York for New York Climate Week, met with a lot of startups, and we heard this refrain a few times, which is, in today's environment, there's no way I would found a company. And that's made even harder by the fact that the elephant in the room is really AI, right? So the portion of VC dollars available out there for startups continues to shrink. And a lot of that is flowing to opportunities in AI and different machine learning technologies. So all this to say, coming back to you as an innovation leader within your organization, either leading an R&D team within corporate venture capital, trying to develop new projects, it's very difficult out there right now. And the one theme you need to really embrace is lean innovation, and accept that you're going to have to find ways to do more with less resources, less headcount, less dollars available. And a lot of what you'll need to do is also manage risk, right? Making sure you're avoiding major pitfalls and using the limited resources that you do have wisely. And so with that, I think we do see an opportunity for innovation clusters to play a role here. And I'll turn it back over to Anthony to talk a little bit more about innovation clusters.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So I think we'll start with a very basic question, which is what is an innovation cluster, right? For us, we define them as organizations that support startups and researchers without directly taking a stake in the startup or owning the technology. I think this is the biggest key difference between, a venture capitalist, an investor, an angel, or a university where they maybe own the IP, and an innovation cluster as a sort of an institution or an organization. Now, this is a pretty loose definition, and as we're going to touch on, some organizations, do have innovation clusters, and they also have a VC, and they take investments, and there's a really wide range of different sort of configurations here. But what we're really talking about is these, sort of non-investor typically groups who are focusing on network effects as a big part of how they're accelerating their innovation, right? So bringing multiple startups together, not just working with one startup or startups in isolation, but trying to bring them together with shared resources and shared expertise. So with that in mind, there are multiple different types of innovation clusters. Now, there's a whole different ways you can categorize these, and indeed, you can look at how they're funded. You can look at who runs them. So there's government, academic, startup accelerators. There's a wide range here. But for us, we think what's most impactful is really categorizing them based on what they do and who they work with. So in this vein, we have four major categories of innovation clusters: networkers, builders, nurturers, and futurists. So the networkers and the builders are both focused on relatively more mature startups. But the difference is really in the sort of services they provide. Networkers are relatively lean. This may be a startup accelerator that provides connections or mentorship as sort of the key focus, maybe events and access to investors or access to collaborators. But it's a relatively lean business model that's focused on facilitating, later stage startups who have a product or startups who have something that's relatively defined. Builders similarly are focused on, relatively later stage startups, not, founders necessarily, but something that's a bit more mature. But they're much more extensive in terms of the suite of services that they offer. Often this includes physical infrastructure, things like labs, potentially research funding, in some cases grants, but much more extensive support and intensive support, right? Then you have the sort of the earlier stage innovation clusters, and here we have the nurturers and futurists. And again, there's a difference here in terms of the level of intensity of support. So the nurturers tend to be, again, that lighter touch, a little bit leaner. They also tend to focus on a regional, although not exclusively. And they're really providing on mentorship, they're providing networking, they're providing maybe access to certain other groups or investors. Whereas the futurists are really investing significant time and resources into very early stage ideas. So taking founders, right, and really helping them scale or helping them develop their company from an idea into something that's much more of a product or a business with, real resources, grants, laboratory access, other forms of support, potentially shared services, a lot of business services, for example, legal services or HR services, right, which founders often lack. So with this, we can understand clusters. But it's not as easy as to just find a cluster and go work with them, right? There's a lot of pitfalls. And these are things we've all heard in different forms from our clients, whether it's okay, we joined this incubator to sort of increase our tech scouting, but the companies weren't really relevant to us, or they were working with an accelerator to advance their innovation, but it just ended up being a time sink that didn't really produce tangible results. And some of our clients have tried to create their own clusters, their own innovation sort of projects, corporate challenges, calls for action, this type of thing, and have had them really sort of fail to materialize an outcome. And that's why we think it's really crucial that you integrate this cluster activity, whatever it is, into your broader strategy. Now, we don't have time to go over all the innovation strategy work we've been doing on this webinar. My colleagues, Dr. Ari Van Berkel and Naveen Krishnamurthy, have just done 2 webinars, sort of a 2-part series on innovation strategy, where they introduced our framework here for innovation strategy and our process. What I will say is that what we're really going to be focusing on here is this organizational design, right? How do you organize your innovation activities? And how do you balance your innovation for the success that you want, right? So we have this matrix here, this sort of 3-point matrix, where there's a balance between control, so actual retention of IP rights, and especially decision-making authority about what technologies get developed, balancing that versus leverage, this ability to de-risk, right? Not just financial leverage, but also time, resources, lab space, expertise, everything that goes into innovation. How can you de-risk that by securing those extra resources? And then how do you get the best technologies? How do you work with world-class solutions? How do you work with the leaders in your space? Or how do you create the best technologies yourself, right? So you kind of have to balance, right? And a good innovation strategy understands what's important and achieves those goals. So we will be mapping the innovation clusters and the different types of innovation clusters to this chart so that we can understand what they do, and we'll give some examples, and then how we can build an innovation strategy here. But first, I want to start with an example of a futurist to get a bit more specific. So Cyclotron Road is a great example here. It is a government-funded incubator. It's actually part of the US DOE. It's in their lab-embedded entrepreneurship program. And it's conducted with another futurist, Activate, which is this broader sort of innovation cluster. But 4 companies in this Cyclotron Road program, they will receive about $250,000 in funding per year for 2 years, split up across a stipend and research funding. This is really intended for very early stage companies, first-time entrepreneurs only, so no serial entrepreneurs, companies who have raised less than $2 million, so really in that pre-Series A sort of seed stage, and they don't have a commercial product. And of course, companies can really benefit from the sort of labs, right? So we're talking about hard science companies here, not typically any software players or fintech, things like that. And I think what's really interesting is because you have the DOE as part of this, selecting these companies, you have a really great vision of what the future is going to look like, and you have a lot of access to important technologies. So you can see that companies like 12, Mosaic, Fervo, which has recently raised $200 million, I think, for a new geothermal well, Brimstone, which does advanced decarbonization tech. These are all companies that were, they're Cyclotron Road alumni, and these are technologies that are hot today. They were being worked on in 2015, 2016, 2017, right? So you get really incredible access to the impactful technologies through this. The problem here is that they really don't have a great system or setup for working with corporates. This is a program that's mostly between the DOE, the program itself, and the startups. They don't do a ton of corporate partnerships, right? They don't do a ton of shaping of the program. So when we map them to our diagram here, our model, you can see this is a great way to get additional leverage. These startups are being funded by the U.S. government, so that's from a corporate innovator, that's ideal, of course, and really accessing excellent technologies. Right, they're in this sort of leverage and excellence axis, but it's very, very difficult. You have almost no control as a corporate incubator or as a corporate innovator over what technologies get selected and what technologies get developed. So if you can develop a relationship with Cyclotron Road, you can really get an eye to what's coming down the future. But you are not going to be able to influence this program very substantially. Moving on to a nurturer, we have Mass Challenge. Mass Challenge, it's based here in Boston. They operate multiple thematic accelerator programs. And this includes various topics and technologies. This includes corporate sponsored programs. So I believe that JP Morgan recently sponsored a FinTech accelerator challenge. And they also have geography specific programs. So I believe they have one for Switzerland, a number of other geographies, right? But when you compare this to Cyclotron Road, this is a much lighter touch program. It's 4 months as opposed to 2 years, focused on mentorship, focused on in-person meetings and roadshows. There's a big focus on founder education. Again, founders might be scientists, but they're typically not lawyers or even CEOs just yet, right? And of course, there's a network there. But there's much fewer sort of, I would say, limitations on applications, right? And there's a much larger network. Cyclotron Road, you're talking about less than 1,000 total startups in that alumni pool. Here, it's more than 3,000. So when you think about this, this is a tool that's impactful for early stage startups, right? This type of mentorship is really going to be most useful for companies who are lacking that expertise, right? That's early stage companies. But there's way more opportunities to work with this type of company and shape it, or I should say work with this type of cluster and shape their activities to suit your innovation needs. So this is really much more towards this sort of control side. If you want to get some leverage, right, by working with startups, accessing that talent pool, and some excellence, right, by, again, accessing a broader talent pool. But really, you can craft the innovation program to your desires, to your needs. That's what's going to be really impactful here. Then we look at a networker, so someone like Plug and Play. This is, I think, a very famous, very high-profile sort of innovation cluster. And this is one where it's kind of a hybrid, right? It's sitting in the gray area because founded as kind of an office space, but from the beginning, they were doing seed investments. And they've slowly expanded into a really wide range of different incubation services. They have their own Plug and Play ventures, right? So there is a venture arm to this, but they also provide accelerator services, co-working spaces, networking, pitch meetings, mentorship events. And they also have a very well-established set of corporate services. So corporate scouting, right? Corporate innovation challenges, all pretty mature and pretty well done. And what they really bring is scale, right? So we're talking about 100,000 startups in the network. So this is a much bigger organization, a much more scaled up organization that these most other clusters can really sort of rival this, right? And here it's much more about sort of mixing and matching that control and leverage, right? But with such a wide spread of startups, I think there's a challenge in really accessing the best technologies, right? This is something that's much more focused on software, fintech. You saw Manscaped as one of the example CEOs or example alumni there. Obviously, that's like a brand, right? A CPG sort of brand. So for many of our clients that are much more focused on the hard sciences, this can be really useful in terms of scouting and accessing some of those startups, a really big pool of startups, but it's not necessarily going to drive technology excellence. And for that, we can turn towards a builder. And I think, sort of the builder par excellence is Greentown Labs, right? Which offers co-working, but also lab spaces, networking, shared resources. This is a cluster that's really focused on relatively, I would say, starting with early stage startups through mature startups, right? in climate tech and clean tech. And they provide this access to shared resources, whether that's a wet lab or manufacturing facilities, right? As well as the sort of network of startups and partners that they have. They're a bit more mature when it comes to working with corporates, right? And they do have some targeted, some specific, technical focus areas through their Greentown Go program. And they really enable deep engagement with startups, and they really enable access to that technology, right? Because these startups are here to find partners and build pilots and really refine their technology. I think there's less control, right? We're talking about a smaller pool of startups. We're talking about a more narrowly scoped technical range, right? But really getting access to the most sort of the highest quality technology and still getting a fair bit of leverage, right? Because again, there are these shared pooled resources that are being utilized by these startups. So you can see that there's a pretty good spread here of different companies. And when we bring these innovation clusters and we include all of the different innovation activities, and again, if you want to learn more about this, you check out those previous webinars. You can see that they actually fit quite nicely, especially some of these early stage, the futurists and the builders. They provide important options for increased leverage and access to excellent technology that just internal innovation efforts don't really necessarily provide by themselves. And just to apply an example to one of your favorite industries, Chris, with utilities, a lot of utilities focus on in-house RD&I and then working with integrators or maybe just licensing technology, right? Really focused on mature technologies and that internal control. And that's great, but that's not necessarily very balanced, right? There's an opportunity, I think, there to get a lot more leverage, right? More bang for your buck. We've talked about the need for lean innovation. And that's where builders like Free Electrons or futurists like For Climate Tech, these other clusters, can really come into play and complement your innovation strategy really nicely. So with that, we'll now take the last few minutes just to talk about what this means for long-term innovation. And I want to make a point here very quickly, which is we did a sort of a CTO survey. We had a number of conversations with CTOs, and generally speaking, they report that during a declining and crisis business cycle, there is a reduced focus on long-term innovation. I think everyone knows this intuitively, but it's our view, it's my view really, that long-term business, or excuse me, these down business cycles, that's really the best time to do this long-term innovation, right? And if you look at the sort of the factors, the decisions, the dimensions of decision making, during these crises, it's really hard to control your level of risk and your level of timing with these incremental innovations. So what I mean by that is, if you're trying to implement something in your factories today, there's a lot of factors that are outside your control, whether it's tariffs, maybe you can't get access to the right technologies or they're much more expensive. Maybe it's business risk. There's outside macroeconomic factors that are going to mean that whatever you implement in this factory is not going to be that successful because the demand for your product is just declining regardless, right? It's a really tough time to do these more incremental innovations. And because we're talking about moving things to scale to really impact the business, it's often more expensive. So instead, we think it's really the right time in these crisis scenarios to do longer term innovation. Because on a very basic level, long-term innovation isn't going to be nearly as impacted by these near-term crises, right? But it's hard to make that case because you have to demonstrate that you're doing things in a lean way. So innovation clusters are a great way to make this long-term innovation lean, right? You can essentially shift some of that money off of your balance sheet, sort of onto an innovation cluster, reduce your own spending, and with more activity, by spending more effort, right, by spending more time, you can still access that long-term innovation. But it's not always easy, and there are some recommendations I think we have, Chris, to actually do this successfully.
Yes, yeah, exactly that. As you pointed out at the beginning of your discussion today, right? There are examples of, hey, I'm working with an innovation cluster and not getting out what I'd like to get out of it. So as you start to think about working with innovation clusters, it's really important to make sure you're aligned with your broader innovation activities. So why are you engaging with this innovation cluster? If you're trying to find technologies that align with your net zero roadmap, that might be very different than looking for specific technology gaps your R&D team has identified, or just monitoring for blind spots of things you might not be looking for but need to be aware of within your industry. Recognize that it takes time. As Anthony just mentioned, this requires effort, putting effort into these innovation clusters to make sure you're getting out what you need to get out of it. And that does require time. And, finally, I think along with investing time, do treat it like an asset, right? This needs to be actively managed. These aren't passive opportunities. You need to actively network, actively go out and connect with founders, participate in some of the steering committees that you might be a part of, deciding who is going to engage with this innovation cluster in the future. And those all those types of activities can help you get more out of it for your innovation cluster. And just some key takeaways as we think about kind of wrapping up today, picking the right type is critical. Right? So think about using kind of that triangular framework that we identified, making sure that your innovation cluster is balanced with the rest of your innovation portfolio, and make sure to set clear goals, right? So maybe it's aligned with one of those net zero frameworks, or address you're engaging with the cluster to maybe address a specific technology gap, but make sure to set clear specific goals with timelines for when you want to identify some of those solutions in working with that cluster. And then finally, kind of I think maybe one of the most important thoughts here is that be patient. This is really about being prepared, that when there is kind of this next frenzied activity, right? This next frenzied activity, and we need to be active in hydrogen, or the next data center AI opportunity, that when those come along, you're ready. You understand the landscape, you understand where the pitfalls are, and where your organization should be actively participating.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. We are now going to be taking questions that you may have in the presentation. So you can type that into the questions box. Again, if we don't get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. And I see a question here, and the question is, how do we evaluate clusters, right? Because I think this is a fair question, right? Because it's like, okay, you've identified, that you want to work with a networker or a builder or what have you, but you actually have to pick which cluster to work with, right? And this is something that we have actually looked at in the past. We actually developed a whole framework and fingerprint for evaluating clusters. So I'm happy to talk more about this. Maybe we'll send you a message after the webinar. What I'll just say quickly is that our general process was first, we would evaluate the startups, right? So actually look, what is the quality of the startups that the cluster is evaluating or is working with. And this is a lot easier for something like, Cyclotron Road or Greentown, where you're talking about hundreds of startups at a time, perhaps, versus, like Plug and Play, right? Where it's this very large organization. We look at that. And then we also developed a scorecard essentially for the facilities, business services, the testing and the piloting services, and especially the government and the local ecosystem relationships. So there's kind of a set of questions, a set of standardized questions we have, and if you're interested, we can touch more on that. Chris, did you have any thoughts on evaluating these clusters? I know you've been involved in some of that work in the past.
Yeah, I think maybe the one piece of advice I have when I was reading that question is to not think of this as there's a best innovation cluster out there, right? I think we at Lux, certainly we've talked about, do we pick the best builder, right? Do we pick the best nurturer? But in reality, it's really about finding the right partner, much more so than if you're looking at startups trying to find the best performance metrics or whose technology is going to scale the fastest or be cheapest, right? So as you noted, if you're focused on hard tech, right, do you want an innovation cluster that has a wet chemistry lab, that has machine shop, the right facilities to help builders build things? So just more so make sure you're picking the right type of partner, much more so than, I think trying to find the best name recognition or, kind of the biggest network per se.
Yeah, the right partner for you is not necessarily the same as for everyone else. I think we don't have any more time for questions. I see we're right at the half-hour mark. So I'll leave it there. And I'll say thanks. First, thank you to you, Chris, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. That's going to conclude our webinar today. So the slide and presentation and the recording will be sent out for all attendees via email today. And after leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey about the presentation. We'd appreciate any feedback that you may have, because this is going to help us inform and improve our future webinars. And you can also take out a moment and look to some of our other future webinars. I know we have a lot coming down the pike. Check that out on our website. Thanks so much, and thank you for joining us, and have a great day.